Just when you thought it was safe to go back to dusty old movies, we're kicking off summer with the beach, water skiing, sailing, and my favorite shark. All here in Jaws 2. While it's certainly not as good as the original, I always have fun watching it, and my summer would not be complete without it.
As Jaws was chomping through box office records, Universal Studios demanded a sequel. Steven Spielberg didn't want to come back. Plus, him and Richard Dreyfuss were busy making Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Howard Sackler, who was an uncredited writer of the first one, wanted the sequel to be based on Quint's USS Indianapolis speech. But at the producer's insistence, the sequel would yet again focus on Chief Brody and the town of Amity. John Hancock was on board to direct, and his wife, Dorothy Tristan, rewrote Howard Sackler's screenplay.
Their vision was a dark and gloomy story where the town of Amity is in economic crisis, with stores boarded up. And the climax, where the shark is attacking the teenagers, was going to take place during a foggy evening at dusk. However, 1 month into production, and John Hancock was fired. The official reason from the producers was that he was ill-equipped to handle such an action-centered kind of movie. But if that sounds a bit fishy, I did hear a more gossipy reason. Some sources say that he was actually fired because Sid Sheinberg, the president of Universal Studios, who was also married to Lorraine Gary, who played Mrs. Brody, had asked Hancock to give his wife a bigger part, and Hancock refused. Either way, John Hancock was out, and a new director, Gino Schwartz, was in.
The mechanical sharks from Jaws 1 had been left to rot on the back lot, so they used the old molds to create a new one. Apparently, to make it look more realistic, they removed the jowls, and they spruced up the mechanical equipment. They had one mechanical shark on a platform, which was called the Luxurious Shark. They had one that was pulled by a boat, and they had just a fin.
The town scenes were filmed in Martha's Vineyard, and all the water stuff was done in Florida. And just like with the last movie, they were working on a script into production, the mechanical shark was breaking down, and they were having trouble with the weather. But because this movie had multiple sailboats instead of just one fishing boat, this time around, the problems were even worse.
Taking place 4 years after the first one, a new great white shark has come to the waters of Amity Island. Chief Brody, who is emotionally scarred from his last shark experience, sees signs of it and becomes obsessed by the idea that a new shark is around. But because the evidence is so measly, no one will believe him. Meanwhile, his teenage son Michael and his friends are having fun in the sun by going sailing, and they plan to sail to Cable Junction for a picnic. But the shark starts to terrorize the group. Upon learning this, Chief Brody goes on a mission to save the teenagers and destroy the shark.
The first Jaws stands with Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho as one of the greatest horror movies of all time. And Jaws 2 doesn't! It's more of a Friday the 13th than a Psycho. It's a cheap slasher movie that happened to have a big budget. But, for what it is, it's actually well done.
In the first film, we barely saw the shark, and that's what made it so scary. In the second one, John Hancock did do one dark and haunting shot where the fin pops out into Amity Harbor, and it gives you this great ominous feeling. The rest of the movie was done by Gino Schwartz, and he felt that the moment where you first see the shark in the first movie could not be duplicated. So he decided to do what everyone told him not to do, and decided to show the shark as much as possible, and I totally dig it.
They do some groovy things with the mechanical shark, and they integrate real shark footage in too to give it more movement. Now, it's not as scary as in the original. Could it ever be? Instead, it's more fun, and just like with Freddy Krueger, it's a ball watching it attack and eat people. And every shark attack is creative and crazy in its own way. In the opening scene, instead of eating one person, it eats two. It eats a helicopter. Talk about a high-end restaurant. And in the most famous scene, it chases down a water skier attached to a speedboat, eats her, and then goes after the driver. Ready for some water skiing, Terry?
If I
Terry
had
needs to
my
shave.
way, I'd always stay in Florida among the palms, with its peaceful air of I don't care and lazy atmosphere that's calm.
Terry? Terry? During this scene, the shark gets burned and scarred, which out of context looks silly, but fits that slasher tone because it makes him look like a Freddy Krueger. And, just like any slasher monster, worth his sea salt. The primary victims are teenagers. As expected for the genre, they don't have that much depth, but I like them. The sailing scenes are fun, and most of them have personalities. There's a nerdy one, there's a goofy one, and I absolutely love that Mayor Vaughn's son, Larry, is a jerk just like him, but without the social graces. You might be scrubbing toilets at the beach. You could totally see how he grew up that way. While the teens are in trouble, Chief Brody becomes the Jaws equivalent of Halloween's Dr. Loomis, which coincidentally came out later that year. By the way, he saves the day and becomes obsessed with the shark. Roy Scheider was forced to make Jaws 2 to fulfill his contract at Universal. He was mad about it, and at one point had a fist fight with the director, which I think is kind of cool. But on screen, he is once again great as Chief Brody. It's been 4 years since the events of the last film, and while the term wasn't being used yet, he's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. It's the same situation where he's telling people there's a shark and no one will listen to him, but this time it's because there's no evidence. Larry, I think we may have another shark problem. I've got a half-eaten whale on the beach. I've got 2 persons missing. I think the selectmen should know about it. I know it's just a feeling, but you've got to understand. We have a lot of deaths in these waters that never turn up. Are they all shark victims? Maybe they are. No one has seen a shark. No one living, that is. He contacts a marine biologist, but she doesn't think there's a shark in these waters. And he can't get a hold of Hooper, the marine biologist from the last movie. So he's all alone in his paranoia. It gets him fired, he starts smoking more, and Roy Scheider happened to have lost weight since the last movie. So it looks like it's affecting him physically too. Once it's officially confirmed that there's a shark, they more or less drop the PTSD and he becomes Super Chief Brody again. Which I find disappointing because I thought that subplot was fascinating. Along with Roy Scheider, my other returning favorite is Murray Hamilton as Mayor Larry Vaughn.
The mayor of Shark City is back to telling Chief Brody that there is no shark in these waters. In the first one, he was more dismissive of Brody, because Brody was new to Amity. But after killing the shark in the first one, the mayor has a new respect for Chief Brody, and actually does look into the possibility of a shark.
Martin, no one has seen a shark. Be realistic. When you called me, I called Elkins and her bosses. Nothing she saw is proof of anything. Even though Mayor Vaughn wouldn't say PTSD in 1978, he certainly believes that Brody is suffering from some sort of shell shock, or shark shock from his experience. And he is partly to blame for that experience. And even though he's telling Brody, please don't do this, he's certainly on his side. And there's a deleted scene where the Amity Town Council is voting to fire Brody, but Mayor Vaughn votes to keep him. But if you watch Murray Hamilton's facial expressions, you don't need that scene. While the returning cast is jawsome, some of the other returning elements don't have the same bite. Jaws 2 reuses several ideas, and none of them are as good as they were in the original. The basic plot is the same, a shark coming to Amity, so we've seen that before.
The story structure is the same, with roughly the first half taking place mostly on land, and the second half mostly at sea. but Schwartz isn't able to infuse the first half with the constant suspense that Spielberg did. Just like in the last one, there's a montage scene. This one's cute, but it bottoms out when it comes to advancing the plot. And the scene where Brody finds a dead body is a less atmospheric version of Hooper discovering Ben Gardner's head. The climax is also staged the same way, with Brody delivering a final punchline before killing the shark.
Open wide! Say ah! Open wide, say ah, just pales in comparison to smile, you son of a... I like Jaws 2 whenever it does its own thing. It has a spirit unto itself. Whenever they rehash ideas, it comes across as a cheap knockoff.
Jaws 2 was one of the highest grossing movies of 1978, and until Rocky 2 came along in 79, it held the record for the highest grossing movie sequel. The movie became iconic in its own right. Its tagline, "Just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water," became one of the most famous taglines in film history, and its ending, with the shark getting electrocuted by a power line, was used in the Jaws ride at Universal Studios. While John Hancock's vision never made it to screen, Marvel Comics did do a comic book adaptation based on the Sackler-Tristan script.
When compared to the original, Jaws 2 is the quintessential disappointing sequel. But if you look at it amongst Deep Blue Sea and Alligator, it's actually quite enjoyable. And I find it fascinating that it taps into so many of the slasher elements before Halloween was even released. So I give it 2.5 fired directors out of 4. Thank you for watching Dusty Old Movies, and have fun swimming this summer.